Good evening, and thank you for joining the Westerly Library in Wilcox Park for tonight's author talk. This program is being presented using the webinar version of Zoom, and attendees are joining in listening mode only. Please send any questions through the Q&A feature at the bottom of your screen, and we'll do our best to answer them within the time we have allotted. Please note that this program is being recorded and will be posted on our YouTube channel at a later date. Should you get disconnected, simply use the link that was emailed to you earlier to get back into the program. Michael Fine, MD, is a writer, community organizer, family physician, public health official, and author of Healthcare Revolt: How to Organize, Build a Healthcare System, and Resuscitate Democracy, all at the same time, and Abundance, a romantic thriller set in Rhode Island and in Liberia in the aftermath of the Liberian Civil Wars. He is currently the Chief Health Strategist for the City of Central Falls, Rhode Island, and he is the recipient of the Barbara Starfield Award, the John Cunningham Award, and the Austin T. Levy Award. And with that, I will now turn it over to our guest author for tonight, Michael Fine.
Thank you very much. It's a great honor to be with you in Westerly. And it's a great honor to be effectively in the library, as I think libraries are the most important places that I know. I wanted to talk a little bit about a new book called The Bull, which is a book of short stories, but also to talk a little bit about fiction and how I think it works in democracy. I started writing many years ago, but got to the point where I thought it was more important that I write than I practice medicine about 10 years ago, as I began to understand the extent to which we have become a divided people. We have become divided for many reasons, and there are many threats to our democracy. We certainly have heard people devalue the importance of democracy itself. We've become segmented by market and by genre so that we don't all have the same experience anymore. We are sorted and we don't live with people different than ourselves very much. And I think because of the way the media works and the way our culture works, we no longer have the experience of people different from ourselves in their complexity. You know, we tend to pigeonhole people as one sort of person or one kind of idea, and that underlies the complexity of the human beings we all are, because none of us fit into those pigeonholes particularly well. We've seen a growing concentration of wealth, and that concentration of wealth has given some people exceptional access to politics and policy, while others have much less access. It is possible for some people to call a governor and get their phone call answered, or to get a new law introduced, while others talk to a secretary or a legislative assistant and get to follow the new laws that get introduced and passed. And that growing inequality has made life, I think, more edgy and less comfortable. And so it has been happening, or I've perceived anyway, that we have less of a common life. Now, I was a lucky guy in many, many ways. I grew up at a time when we did have effectively a common life. I grew up coming off the Second World War, which for all its difficulties was also a time when certainly men from all different parts of the country and all backgrounds went into the service together, fought and died together, and began to see people different than themselves as part of their personal experience and part of their nation. I also grew up at a time when our writers were people who we trusted for their representation of our kind of moral conscience. When I was growing up, William Faulkner, Ernest Hemingway, John Dos Passos, John Steinbeck, James Baldwin, and many others were alive all at the same time. And when there was a national cataclysm of some sort or a national challenge, we turned to our writers and our artists and our musicians to help express what we needed to express as one people. Our writers certainly were mobilizing ideas and thoughts about literature that had come to them from the great tradition of European literature, which served in the same way for the people of Europe anyway. Charles Dickens and Victor Hugo, Leo Tolstoy, in the United States, Charles Chestnut, who not enough people know. Chekhov and Balzac and Dostoevsky and de Maupassant. They spoke for everyone. You know, de Maupassant is famous for his ability to be with people of all walks of life. And that's also true of Victor Hugo and Charles Dickens, and to turn their hopes, dreams, and aspirations, to turn their inner lives into stories that everyone could connect to. So everyone had a sense of common connectedness, of common purpose. And what's a little troubling is that we seem to have lost that sense of ourselves as one people. And with it, I think we've seen the vigor and robustness of the democracy itself feel like it's under siege. So I think that we need to turn to our writers and artists and musicians to be the people who help us dream a single dream as one people. You know, we're not going to all have the same dream exactly, but we need to be able to see into the lives of people who are different than us, understand their inner lives and their thinking. I think that's what we do when people write and when people read. And that helps us be a democracy at the end of the day, because it means we bring to our political and policy processes a sense of humility and our ability to listen to the inner lives and the experiences of others, and to see them as full human beings equal to us, so we can negotiate solutions that work for everyone. And so really now, I'd been writing all my adult life, but about 10 years ago, I stopped everything and focused just on writing short stories and sometimes a policy book or two, and a couple of novels. And the idea of those novels and the idea behind what I'm writing is to allow people to imagine the inner lives of others. So now I think I've talked too much. I think I'm going to take a moment to read a story from The Bull. This one's set in Rhode Island. It's not one that I usually read, but it's a particularly good story for a fall day. It's called, not surprisingly, A Long Way to Fall. First came the gypsy moths, then the southern pine beetle and the emerald ash borer, then the hot, dry summers. 13% of the trees died, 50,000 acres of trees, mostly oak. Good and bad luck bundled together. Climate change, real after all. Sad to lose all those oaks, but dead trees make more work for a tree guy. The best money in forestry is in writing forest plans, subsidized and paid for by the good old USDA. The second best money is the clear cutting of hardwood forests if you can find a forest where the land is flat and the wood is mature. Alan Gordon hated clear cutting, but it paid the bills. Forest plans are mostly desk work, which Alan also hated. Alan liked to be in the woods. Clear cutting was just wrong. He was no tree hugger, let me tell you. A man has to make a living. Still, clear cutting bothered something in his soul. To tell the truth, dropping any tree bothered something in Alan's soul, but it was a small bother, a whisper, not a shout. Clear cutting was the shout. Even so, you can't live on air. A man does what he's paid to do and disregards the rest. They called him to cut a big dead oak in a ravine. Now he was standing beneath it. He came ready to climb with his climbing harness and his green helmet. His orange and white chainsaw hung from his harness, but he sure wasn't going up this tree. Too damn big to get a flip line around. The old oak wasn't the biggest dead tree Alan had ever been asked to drop. No, I'm sorry. The old oak was the biggest dead tree that Alan had ever been asked to drop. Old growth, near as he could make out, 100 feet tall or more, bigger than the 3 other big oaks nearby. Maybe 2, maybe 300 years old, something like 8 feet in diameter at the stump, more than 15 feet around, so big that 3 men holding hands couldn't reach around it. Old oak grows straight up, thrusting out of the earth. A huge trunk with no branches at all until you're 2/3 of the way up. So this one was just ridged gray-brown trunk for 60 feet. Then 3 huge branches, then a leafy crown. 60 feet of climbing without a rest, without a place to secure a line. No way. 60 feet is a very long way to fall. The old oak was in a grove of big oak on a steep slope on a north-facing glacial moraine a couple of 100 yards from the nearest road. The rock-strewn slope was pockmarked by big boulders and broken off hunks of ledge that had been strewn about when the glaciers retreated, with a stream that was a waterfall in slow motion that gurgled and sang as the water came off the hillside and through the rocks. The old oak's ridged bark made Alan think of elephant hide. The bark thickened into ridges that ran straight up and down. The grooves between the ridges were dark gray-brown, almost black, and the bark itself was warm to the touch, warmer for sure than the late October air. The tree felt old and wise. The grove of big oak reminded Alan of a herd of elephants, also old and wise, slow-moving but ponderous, balanced, resilient, and all-knowing. Condos. They were going to build condos in a rocky gorge that was good for nothing, that was too rocky and too sloped to farm, and too dark, because it was north-facing, to use for grazing. No one had ever wanted to put a house here. No one even hunted here. The slope was too steep. There was a story about a wolf den once, back before the settlers came. Wolves and snakes, maybe, but not good for people. The old oak had grown undisturbed for hundreds of years. Only now, some developer was going to turn this grove of old oak into condos and parking lots. They were going to bulldoze a long drive in from the road, terrace the hillside, pour foundations, and build themselves a development right into this slope, just so some rich guy could make himself a bundle. Condos on both sides of the stream, which they were going to leave because it was way too expensive to divert. The stream, which once fell between the rocks in the dark glen and became a rushing waterfall after a hard rain when the snow melted, would become scenic natural beauty, a selling point for the development that was about to take the place of a beautiful grove of old growth oak that had never been cut, that had rarely been walked under by human people and could never be replaced. You'd never get a bucket truck up here, Alan thought. Not that any bucket truck would be of any use. The damn tree was too tall and the branches were too big to cut from below. No way to limb this tree. The damn thing would have to come down whole. A whale of a tree, bitch and a half to drop. More dangerous than dynamite. Alan walked around the tree. Big, really big. Bigger than it looked. Then he walked around it a second time. It wanted to fall northeast, up the slope, because the biggest branch grew in that direction, 60 feet up and itself likely 3 feet in diameter. Alan mapped his escape. The first thing he did when he was getting ready to drop a tree, because you never really know how a tree is going to fall. There was another big oak about 20 yards away, but there were a couple of big rocks, thick brush, and a few saplings between the big one and that one. Rocks he'd have to weave around and brush he'd have to navigate if he were going to have to try to get out of the way of a surprise fall. Pretty sketchy as a route to safety. Hard to know how much time he'd have if the monster fell the wrong way. Hard to know how much protection another tree would give him once this monster started to move. The fall of a 20-ton tree is like a small nuclear explosion. Once the tree leaned a little, once it started to fall and picked up speed, it would obliterate anything that lay beneath it. The earth would rock when it hit the ground. They'd hear the crash a mile away, the sound of a locomotive hitting a concrete wall. Its huge branches and any tree in its way would be splintered by the force of the fall. Alan would need a 60-inch saw to drop a tree this big with a bar that was almost as long as Alan himself was tall. The bar alone cost more than most of Alan's chainsaws. It would take days to hollow out the trunk, to carve blocks of wood that were each as wide as most of the trees Alan usually dropped. Once he had it on the ground, it would take most of a week to cut the branch into slabs, split the slabs, and haul them out. You'd need a front-end loader to move those slabs and a good-sized dump truck to cart them away, but you'd have to carve yourself a little road just to get that equipment in, and you'd make a mess of the forest floor and that little waterfall. If you left the damn tree alone, the world wouldn't end. If you just left it, it would fall on its own eventually. It would rot from the inside the way oak does, because oak is a wet wood, and it would drop its branches one by one. It might take 30 or 40 years for the tree to fall on its own, maybe more, then another 20 or 30 years for it to rot. No harm would come from doing nothing. Old trees died, fell, and rotted for millions of years before humans came around. The world carried on very well without us then. Thank you very much. But that was before condoms. A man has to make a living. The tree was dead. It had to come down. There were no two ways about it. And then the rest of that old oak grove with it. They were just trees. Trees grow back. Trees would grow in other places as well. Alan bid the job. He took care to cushion his bid so there'd be a margin in case things didn't go as he planned. So he'd make sure to make decent money. He included 3 weeks of work and the cost of that long bar. A part of him hoped he wouldn't get the job. Lots of dough. He'd make plenty if the tree came down smoothly, as long as he didn't get squashed like a bug in the process. He'd still likely come in under his competitor, a national tree removal operation with thousands of green trucks, a famous name in the industry, and so much overhead that Alan could usually underprice them on specialized jobs like this. 10 days to drop the big oak, a week to cut that sucker up. Alan knew trees and the tree business better than anyone. Alan got the job. One day, about 3 weeks later, Alan stood under the old oak holding his big still, his best saw, but boy, it felt puny now compared to the size and majesty of that oak. He started to work. First, he prepared his escape route. He cut the brush and the saplings nearby and moved as many rocks as he could between the old oak and its neighbor tree, so there was a clear path to some protection. Then his saw touched the bark of that tree for the first time. The tree was just wood, just like any other tree. The saw sprayed a shower of tiny brown and yellow wood chips away from the trunk, a shower of wood chips mixed with white smoke from the saw's exhaust. The saw whined as it cut, a mechanical screech that rose and fell in pitch as Alan squeezed the trigger of the saw. The air smelled from the exhaust, the smell of burnt gasoline and 30-weight oil. First, Alan laid in a felling cut, a huge V notch on the side and in the direction that the tree would fall. That cut took him 10 hours to place because of the size of the trunk. Then Alan put on the 6-foot bar and laid in a base cut on the side away from the side of the fall, notching out slabs of wood the size of shipping cartons to create a lateral cave almost big enough to fit a man inside the trunk itself. He placed wedges as he worked, blocks of wood that could support the tree's weight as protection, so the weight of the tree didn't shift and surprise him, so the tree would fall exactly where he planned it to drop. It took 3 days to finish the base cut. That left the trunk hollowed out, so there were just 2 columns of wood, one on each side, holding the weight of the trunk. Alan could see through the trunk at its base. A strong wind could have dropped the tree at that point. The weight of the tree, shifting with the wind, would have splintered the support columns of wood once the mass of the thing began to move. And then the whole trunk would come down, smashing everything in its path. While Alan worked, the developer had a bulldozer cut a dirt road in from the street so a front-end loader and dump trucks could get to the site. The sound of machinery, of grinding gears, the whine of the chainsaws, the hammering, and the voices of men yelling over the noise filled the dark north-facing glen, and now the air smelled of motor oil, grease, and diesel exhaust. It was fall. The leaves were off most of the maples, but the oak trees that were still alive held on to their leaves as they always do, dark green and brown leaves that stay waving in the wind long after most of the other leaves have fallen. There were slashes of red, hickories that hadn't lost all their leaves, and of yellow birch leaves that hadn't yet dropped. The white birches could now be seen in the woods, white slashes on a gray and brown hillside, their white trunks bringing order and grace to the woodland. Exclamation marks against the gray and brown rocks, their yellow leaves of brilliant gold, a hint or a reminder of life everlasting, which, of course, it isn't. Better to work in the fall when the air is cool, even though the days are shortened and the sun, low on the horizon, glints into your vision. Too damned hot in the summer, and the long days let you work way past exhaustion, which is when you make mistakes. When the back cut was nearly finished, Alan walked away to recheck the tree and his calculations. The weight was to one side. Gravity would put that tree where Alan wanted it. All he had to do was finish the back cut and get out of the way. Gravity is a tree guy's friend, as long as it's not your enemy. There was no margin of error now. Alan cut the first of the 2 support columns with an old, almost worn-out still, holding his breath as he cut. No reason to lose your best saw if something went wrong. They were very close now. The weight of the tree settled into the new cut, closing it. The least wind could now send the tree crashing down. Then he placed the last cut. He touched the old still to the remaining wood. His eyes were fixed on the cut he was making, and he held his breath again. This was the moment of greatest danger. The faintest breeze might cause the tree's fall, might push the tree the wrong way, crushing him. Or if he read the tree wrong, gravity alone might drop it in a different way on top of him, or it might twist as it fell, and Alan would be a pancake just the same. Once the tree started to move, once it started to fall, there was no turning back. 20 tons of wood. The tree would crush anything and everything in its path. Then the space above the saw became a tiny bit larger than it had been. The cut he was placing opened just a millimeter, almost undetectable. Something had changed, had moved. The tree was starting to fall. Alan cut the saw's engine and ran like hell. The tree didn't sway or twist. It hesitated, wise at its tipping point. It leaned a little, just an inch or two at first, and then all hell broke loose. Wood cracked and groaned. The massive tree toppled, opening a whole new sky behind it. The old oak came to earth with a whoosh and a crash and a boom, shaking the earth as if a meteor had landed. And it drove the boulders that lay beneath it deep into the ground. The entire universe was sucked into the tree's fall for a moment. The air, the trees and brush beneath it, the rocks and the stream jumped and then trembled in the aftershocks. Then the woods fell still. The big oak lay on the ground, a continent on its side. An era ended. There was light in the woods where there had been only shade. A cool breeze came up. The red leaves of a shagbark hickory nearby that Alan hadn't noticed twisted in that breeze. Some of those leaves fluttered to the ground. Time marches on. The old oak was on the ground, and Alan had failed to die dropping it. Alan began to limb the tree. He first cut the branches that were furthest out and had been highest in the sky, working back toward the trunk. The branch wood was already dried, already brittle. Dry wood is hard on chainsaws. Cutting the trunk was a huge job, but he had a week to do it. He'd get it done. The sun was starting to set. It was red and gold and purple at the edges of the horizon. Alan put his saws in the truck and went home. Sad to see the old monster go. Good that the oak came down neatly and fell where he wanted it to fall. Good he'd survived this one without getting hurt. Ducked another bullet. Live and let live if and when you can. A man has to make a living. As he fell asleep that night, Alan remembered the new light and the new sky that were where the old oak had been, and the red and yellow leaves that fluttered down in this new space. There was nothing else left to know. The old oak was on the ground. Alan was still alive for another moment or two. And that is the end of that story. So perhaps we might open things to questions and discussion. I'm particularly interested in hearing people's thoughts about where we are with this democracy, and to hearing people's questions about how we can make the democracy more vigorous and more alive. Amanda, are there any questions in the chat?
Yeah, at the moment, I don't see any questions actually. So I don't know if you have anything that you'd like to add on to those questions. I certainly encourage anyone who is attending right now to go ahead and send any questions through the Q&A at the bottom there.
Well, if we don't, while we're waiting, if we don't have questions, do you think it would be reasonable for me to read a second story from the new book called Rhode Island Stories, which is going to come out in about a month?
Sure, absolutely. I think they'd love that. We still have about 30 minutes, so.
Great. This is also set in Rhode Island. The last one was actually set in Foster. I'm sorry I don't have one set in Westerly itself. I do have a couple set in Point Judith and Narragansett, but they're very different places from Westerly anyway. So let me read this one that is set in Scituate and Johnston. It's called Isaiah on Route 6. At least she was wearing a mask. That was the only normal thing about the woman. She appeared out of nowhere in front of the old motel near Cindy's Diner across the street from the IGA Plaza where the Chinese restaurant is, where Walgreens is, which used to be Rite Aid, which used to be Brooks Drugs, which used to be Greg's Pharmacy, across the street from the gas station where they fill up propane tanks, down the street from the hardware store. She was almost 6 feet tall, and she was walking on the side of the road toward Johnston and Providence. She had this great, strong stride, nothing shy or contained about this woman. She walked with purpose. She wasn't mumbling to herself, spitting, shouting, or looking from side to side at unseen voices or at people she could see and hear but who weren't there. Dreadlocks, to be sure, but neat dreadlocks. Her face was smudged with something dark and gray, almost like war paint, which looked like it had been put there by design. She did not look like a woman who'd been sleeping in the woods, let me tell you. She was pretty well put together. But the way she was dressed, man, that didn't make any sense at all. Some kind of brown bag, shapeless. Something like she was wearing something like a burlap bag. But who's even seen burlap in like 30 years? There's no law against walking on the side of the road. In the time of COVID, you don't want to go near anybody. She wasn't obviously crazy, just weird. Who walks in America anymore anyway? People hike, sure, with hiking boots and fancy day packs, or those water sacks on their back, which have tubes sticking out, and with high-tech walking sticks, one in each hand, that makes it look like they're rowing, not walking. Or people bike the back roads on $10,000 bicycles made from space-age materials and wearing spandex biking shorts. But no one ever walks now. People drive when they have someplace to go. That's just the way it is. And nobody called it in. Probably no one else even noticed or even saw her. You don't see what you've never seen before most of the time, even if it's right in front of you. Like that old story about the Fugans and Magellan ships. They say that the Fugans, the native people who live on the southernmost tip of South America, couldn't see Magellan's ships when he sailed around Cape Horn, even though those ships were anchored right offshore. The Fugans didn't know how ships were made or what they do. Those ships were so far from the Fugans' experience that the ships had no meaning to the Fugans at all. So the Fugans didn't recognize those ships. We see only what we already know. So no one else saw her. Live and let live, I said to myself, but let me check on her once in a while. Black lives do matter. There was probably some of that in my brain. Law-abiding citizens. There was some of that in my brain as well. No need for any confrontation or any trouble. The state cop drove back and forth as I walked down Route 6. I stayed off the road, so there wasn't any reason to arrest me. Getting arrested wouldn't have been terrible, but it was beside the point. Sitting in some jail cell in Scituate or Johnston, or ending up at intake, the ACI, wasn't going to do anyone any good. The modern version of getting swallowed by a whale. Out of sight, out of mind. I wanted to be present so people could see me and be freaked out, feel confused, and start thinking. It's not just about racism. There's way too much racism in the good old USA for sure, and it's crushing to the soul. But even racism is a symptom. Greed is the cause. Greed, arrogance, materialism, jealousy, lust, it's all in the mix. Narcissism. Only I matter. Only what I want counts. Only what I see and feel exists. We talk ourselves into little boxes from which we never emerge. They might see a Black woman with dreadlocks walking on Route 6, but they don't see the sackcloth and they don't see the ashes and they don't think about repentance and they never look at themselves. None of us do. Never think that our wants and our choices are actually the cause of this pandemic and the rest of this big empty mess, the stupid lives we've chosen for ourselves and one another. Their cars whizzed past on Route 6, but they didn't see me at all. All they see are other cars while their radios play Spotify, NPR, or WPRO. Maybe they see a crazy homeless Black woman because everybody walking must be homeless, right? Maybe they roll up their windows so they don't get panhandled when they stop at the light near the liquor store or the one in front of the gas station across the street from Bishop's Hills Tavern, or the one at the pool store in Cumberland Farms just past where the old subway and the old fire station used to be. Let the oppressed go free. Feed the hungry. Bring the homeless into thine own house. Cover the naked. Thou shalt not hide thyself from thy fellow humans. Care for the widow and the orphan. Let justice well up as the waters and righteousness as a mighty stream, etc., and so forth. You know the drill. We got plagues again now. COVID and whatnot. Black people getting shot in the back by police, riots in the cities, climate change with its floods and its fires, swarms of locusts in Africa, the whole 9 yards. You think anybody in America would ever roll down the windows of their cars, turn off their car stereos and ask me what the heck I'm doing, decked out in sackcloth and ashes, walking down Route 6 in the late afternoon? Or think for 1 second about what's going on in this crazy world we built where people can't be in the same room together anymore? I crossed over into Johnston, walked down that strip across from Cumberland Farms where the pool store is, walked past the tire place, the auto parts store, Tractor Supply, Dunkin' Donuts, and the dollar store. It was late in the afternoon by then. The trees around the reservoir were red and gold. The air was filled with falling leaves and smelled of overripe grapes, maple leaves, diesel exhaust, and wood smoke. You don't really live unless you walk in the fall air. You live and you feel and you breathe when you walk. Mine eyes were seeing the glory of the coming of the Lord right here and now in Johnston, Rhode Island. You might think the Johnston cops would have noticed. You know how they are, but nothing. Nobody even slowed down to gawk. Just that state cop who drove by every couple of minutes. I wasn't expecting the guy at the house near the reservoir. The houses there are on a narrow strip of land between the road and the water. No sidewalk. She had to walk on the lawns and the driveways with only mailboxes between her and the whizzing cars, which all do 55 in a 30-mile-an-hour zone, just saying. Okay. There was a big flag flying in front of a huge flagpole in front of that house. The guy comes barreling down the road in a big blue F-350 with double rear tires and a swept-up exhaust that was pouring out black smoke. 2 American flags, one on each side, snapped and fluttered in the wake of that truck, which coughed and bellowed and then quieted as it slowed where that woman was walking and turned right into the driveway just in front of her. I didn't, hang on just a second. I didn't want trouble right then and there, but you always got to be ready. So I threw on my lights and swung the car around. There are 2 lanes in each direction over there. My vehicle closed off one of those lanes. Pretty soon there was a backup of 10 or 15 cars. The cars slowed and people turned their heads to see what was going on as if they had never seen a state police car with its light bar lit up. The guy came out of the truck and ran right at her. No mask. Holy shit, I thought, here it is. Stop, I yelled. My service revolver was pointed at the guy. I didn't even think about it. It was just there. But it was too late. The guy grabbed her before he even heard me. Janine, the big guy yelled. He was a big bear of a guy, 6'2" or 6'3", and 300 pounds if he was an ounce. Dwayne, she yelled back. And she wrapped him in a big bear hug. Then they looked at me. You have a problem, the woman said. You know each other, I said. Like for 100 years, the big guy said. We work together at the ACI, the woman said. I'm a psychologist. I run the auto shop in industries, the big guy said. Teach the guys a trade. I holstered my gun and shook my head. Maybe there is a God after all. So, 2 stories, both set in Rhode Island. 2, 3, you got to meet 4 fairly different people. Some surprises in there, I expect. These are all people who I think many of us know or feel like we know. They're all part of our lives. And the challenge is for us to listen to every single voice and make sure every voice is heard, make sure every voice is represented. That's what I think helps us make democracy happen. Amanda, any other questions?
Yes, with that, we do have something from Rachel. She asked, does democracy work better when the citizens share the same information sources? I can't see how we can agree on anything or be united in a way forward when we get our news from such polar opposite sources as the New York Times and Fox News.
Rachel, I think you're right. And I remember the day when, there were 3 major networks and Ed Sullivan on Sunday night at 7 o'clock. And we all kind of watched the same stuff. I think it was easier then. But now we've got this, sort of segmentation, fractionation, different kinds of news and different perceptions about the truth. And that to me means this is the time when fiction and poetry and music and art are most important, because as people develop this different information, then it falls to people who can use the imagination to help us see ourselves as one people, to help us listen to and understand these different perspectives and point of view and meld them into a coherent story, which, if you take a giant step backward, I think we really have. The challenge is to see it that way and not to turn people who each of us disagree with into the enemy, but to listen to where they're coming from and what they're thinking, because most of them, even the ones that I think I disagree with, have a point that I haven't heard yet, and then I try to work a little harder to hear in the process. I spend a good part of my writing time writing the perspectives of people who I know but don't spend a lot of time talking to. And I think it's important to both write those perspectives and to read them, and to imagine the places where what I think is true might not be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, and to imagine the ways in which things I think are not true might have some element of truth in it, so that we can figure out a common ground.
Thank you for that, Michael. At the moment, we don't have any other questions.
Okay. Well, then maybe we should say thank you to the library for doing this. Thanks to everyone for coming. I have a little website. It's michaelfinemd.com. I put out 1 short story a month for free. If you go onto the website and sign up, you will have that short story arrive magically in your inbox once a month. And I'm always thrilled to be in libraries, to work with book clubs. I'm trying to get to every single library in Rhode Island once a year, because I think libraries, more than any other institution, except perhaps public schools, exemplify what we mean by democracy and are the places where democracy carries forward. So I've got a new book coming out in October called Rhode Island Stories. Also information available through the website, which again is michaelfeinemd.com. Love to have people jump on, read the stories, tell me if they think I'm crazy. I've had great discussions with people who read the stories and sometimes agree, sometimes disagree. Once I had somebody write me, sort of bawling me out for taking a political perspective, and then I got to say, well, go back and read this story, would you? Because the political perspective that person thought I was taking was actually the opposite of the one that was in the story. So always great fun, and the ability of us to talk together, to think together, to read together, is the ability that makes that lets this democracy happen. Amanda, thank you very much again for your work putting this together.
Thank you so much, Michael. We really appreciate it on behalf of the library. Thank you so much for taking the time.
Thanks.
Have a good evening, everyone.